Hello and welcome. In the early 1950s, buses tended to look like this. This in fact is a 1951 Guy Arab. The engine and the driver sat at the front in glorious isolation while the platform and the staircase was at the back. They were normally around 27 feet long. Around this time, Leyland Motors was producing its well-known Leyland Titan PD range. This particular bus dates from 1963, but it was the same basic design. The 27-foot long length restriction was somewhat restrictive, and bus operators were desperate to cram as many seats in as they could. With underfloor engined single-decker buses becoming more popular, which allowed a bigger seating capacity for the passengers, thought was given by Leyland Motors to re-engineering the double-deckers as well. The solution was to put a smaller engine on the back platform of the bus. The first prototype appeared at the end of 1952. This was joined by a second prototype in 1954. The second one differed from the first one by not only having a half-cab bodywork, but also having a pneumocyclic gearbox, while the first one had a Wilson pre-select gearbox, which was the same as the London RTs at the time were receiving. For the time, they were both very advanced buses, being fitted with independent front suspension, a drop centre rear axle, and an 0350 turbocharged Leyland diesel engine. The first prototype had a full front body and was bodied by Saunders Roe and looked very much like a trolley bus. The second one, with the half cab, was to a more conventional design bodywork built by MCW. Both prototypes saw a fair bit of use with various bus companies around the country. On the 1st of July 1956, the British Constructions and Use regulations were changed. This permitted the use of two-axle double-decker buses up to 30 feet long. Leyland decided to take full advantage of this and moved the front axle back to create a front platform. The theory being that the driver would be able to supervise the platform while the bus conductor was left to collect the fares. The bus by now had been christened the Leyland Atlantean and was given the designation PDR, passenger double-decker rear engined. It was now fitted with the more acceptable and familiar 0600 diesel engine. It still retained its independent front suspension and drop centre rear axle. Two prototypes were built to this specification. One saw limited use with various bus companies, while the other one was extensively tested by Leyland. But there was a problem. Noise levels at the rear of the saloon from the enclosed rear engine and the independent front suspension and drop centre rear axle made the bus very expensive. Between 1956 and 1958, Leyland put a lot of time into trying to bring down the cost of the Leyland Atlantean. They decided to fit it with conventional axles. This, coupled to a more conventional chassis with leaf springs, managed to bring the cost down. This obviously worked because at the 1958 Commercial Motor Show, 200 Leyland Atlanteans were ordered. A Glasgow bus that had been exhibited at the show was the first one to be released into service by one day. It was bodied by Alexander and cost £6,150. As of 2023-2024, that figure would equate to £180,000. The second bus into service was an MCW bodied example for Wallasey Corporation. Wallasey had ordered 10 MCW bodied Leyland Atlanteans at the 1956 Commercial Motor Show. They'd also agreed to buy demonstrator 281 ATC, although in the end this was never sold by Leyland. Over the next few months, Leyland Atlanteans started to enter service. Leyland's decision to replace the drop centre rear axle with a conventional axle caused a few problems though when they wanted a lower height bus. The result was a curious semi-low bridge design with a side gangway at the rear half of the upper deck. 1959 saw the development of yet another style of Leyland Atlantean, the Atlantean coach. The most luxurious of these were ordered by Ribble. These contained a toilet, a servery, and were powered by the larger 0680 Leyland engine and could top 64 miles an hour. From the driver's perspective, the Leyland Atlantean was like nothing else they'd driven at the time. The pneumocyclic gearbox made gear changes easy compared to the constant mesh or the synchro mesh of half-cab double-deckers of the period. There was no clutch to wrestle with. The only complaint was on the early examples the steering and the throttle could be heavy. From a passenger's perspective, the Atlantean gave a very comfortable ride, although those fitted with air suspension did sometimes give a little bit of a choppy ride, and it was not unknown for crews and passengers to feel a form of seasickness. Early 1960s air suspension technology does leave a lot to be desired. Noise levels weren't too bad in the lower saloon and were pretty much non-existent in the upper saloon. And then there was the novelty of being able to walk past the driver into the bus, which in the 1950s and 60s, that cannot be underestimated. That must have been a huge thing, and certainly something now that we do take for granted. Originally, rear axle ratios were offered that allowed speeds of 35, 40 and 45 miles an hour. As I previously mentioned, a further ratio was added that allowed speeds up to 64 miles an hour. In 1963, Leyland released the Atlantean Mark II. This was given the chassis designation of PDR1/1. Leyland had been gathering information from the operators of the early Leyland Atlanteans and had made a few small details to the basic design. These included such things as the relocation of the gearbox EP control unit, bolted gearbox mounting brackets instead of the welded ones to facilitate gearbox removal and replacement. The large one-piece engine bonnet was replaced by a three-piece unit to make access to the engine and gearbox a lot simpler. The Leyland 0600 engine was tweaked somewhat, and the centrifugal clutch was replaced by a self-changing gears fluid clutch. In 1960, the rival Daimler Fleetline rear-engined double-decker bus was released. This, from the outset, was designed with a drop-centre rear axle, which meant that you could have a true low-height version of the bus. Probably inspired by this, in 1964 Leyland released the Atlantean PDR1/2. This was fitted with a drop-centre rear axle, which was being built at the time for the Leyland Lowlander, the low-height double-decker front-engine bus. Total of 344 of the awkward semi-low bridge design Atlanteans had been built, which were at a height of 13 foot 4 inches. The PDR1/2 maintained this height, but with the conventional centre gangways on both decks. As production moved into the mid-60s, there were several further changes with the Atlantean design. A special short wheelbase version of the PDR1/2 was released. This was quite a limited production run though, with just 3 being supplied to Great Yarmouth with row bodywork and an overall length of 28 foot. This made them incredibly manoeuvrable and also suitable for one-person operation. At the 1966 Commercial Motor Show, Leyland exhibited a long wheelbase Atlantean chassis. This could take bodywork up to 33 feet long. This longer chassis had conventional axles, i.e. didn't have the drop centre rear axle, but also had the larger 0680 power unit. This model was designated PDR2/1. In February 1972, after nearly 6,000 PDR type Leyland Atlanteans had been built, Leyland announced an upgrade with the AN68 range of the Atlantean. The AN being for the chassis name Atlantean and the 68 for the 0680 engine, which was now standard. The updated chassis had provisions for a wider entrance and wider gangways. The steering box and brake controls had much better crash resistance. A fail-safe parking brake system was fitted. Stainless steel air pipes were fitted, which gave a much better protection against corrosion. And there were several changes to mechanical units. This was to help maintenance and servicing and also improve reliability. Two models of the AN68 were released. The AN68-1R, which was suitable for bodywork up to 30 feet long, and the AN68-2R, which was suitable for bodywork up to 33 feet long. In the mid-1970s, it had been hoped that the brand new B15 Leyland Titan would replace the Leyland Atlantean, the Daimler Fleetline and the Bristol VR, which were now all under the common manufacturing ownership of British Leyland. However, those who know their history will know that this didn't happen, and the Atlantean continued to sell in very, very respectable numbers throughout the 1970s. For anybody under the age of 30 who perhaps never saw Leyland Atlanteans in service, the Atlantean became a very popular sight and sound in cities and towns around the UK. You could be in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Manchester, Leeds, Southampton or Portsmouth and you would see and hear Atlanteans howling along the streets. There was plenty of variety as well, not only from the colour point of view with the liveries, but each operator specified their own style of bodywork. An example being that in Scotland, Edinburgh went for a very curvaceous bodywork by Alexander with big panoramic windows on a long wheelbase chassis. Meanwhile, down on the south coast, Portsmouth City Transport also went for Alexander bodied Leyland Atlanteans, but theirs were of the short wheelbase design. They weren't quite so curvaceous and they had the shorter, smaller windows. There was plenty of variety like this all the way across the country, even in the pretty regimented National Bus Company fleets. You would find bodywork by Rowe, Park Royal and Eastern Coachworks to a single door and dual door design. As I mentioned before, the AN68 soon became the standard Leyland Atlantean in the UK. During the production run of the Atlantean though, there were a few single-decker ones made. Not many. This one was for Great Yarmouth and was bodied by Marshall. Portsmouth also took a batch of single-decker Leyland Atlanteans. The Atlantean proved very successful as an export model too, with buses being sent to Sweden, Portugal, Iraq and Australia, just to mention a few of the countries the Atlantean ended up in. As with all good things, the end must eventually come. The introduction of the Leyland Olympian in the early 1980s saw the end of the Bristol VR and the Fleetline production. Leyland Atlantean production staggered on until 1986, with the AN68 now being joined by the AN69, which featured a turbocharged 0690 Leyland engine. The last UK Atlanteans went to Merseyside, while the last export Atlanteans were for Baghdad and Kuwait. Fortunately, that is not the end of the story. Many Atlanteans went on to see service into the new millennium, with second, third and fourth hand ownership being common. And thanks to the dedication of bus preservationists, Leyland Atlanteans thrive in preservation. Most running days and bus rallies will yield at least one Leyland Atlantean. Few can argue that the Leyland Atlantean was the most successful rear-engine bus ever built, with 15,000 built during the production run. It was only really in London where the Atlantean was not so successful. London Transport bought 50 for evaluation in the mid-1960s. It then decided that single-decker buses were much better than double-decker buses, and then it thought the Daimler Fleet Line was the better bus, before thinking that the Routemaster was much better than all of these and hanging on to an outdated design. But that's a story for another day. If you enjoyed this omnibus size edition of Bus Histories, don't forget to click like and share it amongst your unsuspecting friends and family. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel too. It helps the channel grow and it helps me produce more videos like this one. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Bye bye.